Welcome to our sixth Teach Climate meeting, where we will talk climate change education and talk about South Pole Station by Ashley Shelby. Pardon my dog if you can hear him whining in the background.
Not too bad.
Good. Couple of quick things before we get started. Looks like we have a newbie. So excited. You want to just introduce yourself real quick? Nothing too specific, but.
Oh, yes. So my name is Isam. The way I found out about this meeting was that I'm actually an undergraduate student doing doing research on cli-fi, and my professor she sent out an email to I guess to a listserv about any group that's discussing cli-fi, and then I think Devardi. Yeah, Devardi. She reached back, and then I got in touch with her, and she sent me a link, so I'm here.
Great. Well, welcome. I'm Jenna Tots. I'm from Climate Generation. We've been doing this book club for 1.5 years now. Actually, Devardi was the start of it. She came to one of our institutes and presented and talked about how awesome it would be to put together a book club to talk about cli-fi and climate change nonfiction. And we at Climate Generation do a lot of professional development with teachers and have always wanted to find a way to continue the conversation with them after professional development over the summer. And, you know, we haven't had a huge group each week, but the ones that are coming keep coming back, which is awesome. So it's fun, and we've talked about some really fun books. So happy you could join us, and yeah, it should be a good conversation tonight. It's definitely a book that is for an adult crowd. You know, we do read everything from elementary up through adult books. But just the way we do this is very informal. Participate when you want. If you've got something to say, go ahead and say it. If you've got stuff going on in the back, you can keep yourself muted, but I don't hear anything that is coming through at all. This will be my last book club that I will host and lead. Megan Van Lowe, our new education coordinator, will step up next week. I'll still come on, but she will step up and she will lead that meeting. And then I'll be on maternity leave after that. So the last couple, Kristen and Megan will be leading those. But be thinking about other cli-fi and climate change nonfiction, because at the end of the year, we will definitely ask for everybody's input about what they want to read next year. So.
Jenna, do we already know what the next book and date are? Because I don't think I have that.
Empty is the next book. It's by Suzanne Wen. And it is March 20th at this point. I may change that date. It's a Wednesday. We have our STEM Expo with Minneapolis Public Schools that day. And Kristen is out all day at a science standards meeting in Minnesota. So I might change it just because it might be kind of a crazy day. But at this point, March 20th and Empty. It's a short read. The last couple of books have been kind of long. So definitely a short read, and we will talk through this one at the end. So, and you can go, I'll make sure I send out the link again. If you go to the Teach Climate page, it has the next books and dates through May. So we'll be our last one. So. All right. So again, super chill environment. Real quick, Wendy and Betsy, if you want to introduce yourselves real quick, just to give some context as to who you are and where you are.
Sure. Well, I see I'm unmuted. It looks like Betsy's unmuted, so I'll go first. I'm Wendy Abshire. I'm the director of the American Meteorological Society's education program, and we teach K-12 teachers to know more about weather, ocean, and climate science themselves, and they get graduate credit for taking our courses. And then we also create and provide at low cost curriculum packages to undergraduate faculty at institutions looking to start up a weather, ocean, or climate course for their undergrads, especially at minority serving institutions or community colleges that may not have strong geoscience departments that they can rely on for starting these courses, but they still want to offer them. We make it easy for them to do that.
Okay, thanks. Betsy?
And then I'm Betsy Wilkening. I'm in Tucson, Arizona, and work at the University of Arizona. And we do a water education program as part of Project WET, or Arizona Project WET. And that is pretty encompassing where I am. We do a lot of teacher professional development. I have educators that work in the classroom. And part of what we're doing with climate is working on community resilience stuff by doing rainwater harvesting at schools and trying to sink the rain and grow some shade here.
That's cool.
Great. Thank you. All right, well, let's just hop right in. If someone wants to start talking about the book, I guess just really quick. South Pole Station, just in general, is about an artist that goes down to the South Pole on a National Science Foundation program and works to try to do art down at the South Pole. And in the midst of all that, there's groups of scientists, there's groups of people that help the station run. And then the climate change connection is that a climate change denier comes down to the pole to do some research and kind of gets everybody stirred up while Cooper, our artist, is down there. So if anyone wants to start to give their 2 cents, what they liked and didn't like, how they would potentially use this, or just kind of what they thought of it.
Well, there were a lot of things I liked, and I'd love to say those and tell the author and get more feedback. The one thing I didn't like was that I found what I felt like were gratuitous sexual mentions in the context of science just stuck out to me. I mean, I've lived my whole life as a scientist. I have had my Me Too moments. I mean, I'm not a prude. They just didn't match to me. They seemed like they were placed there like a soap opera or something. And so they really stuck out to me. I was like, that sounds awkward and weird and not right to me. Mm-hmm. And so I was like, okay, well, we'll skip past that soap opera piece and keep going, because there were a lot of things I did like.
Mm-hmm. Well, that I think was a theme that came up last month too. The book we read was Weather Woman, so they're very similar with a female main character, but that was kind of the same thing. There was a couple of instances in the book where it was like, was that necessary to put that in, and how does that fit within the context of the story? But yeah,
I know.
What do you think are the reasonings, or maybe?
I know, like, a lot of polar trek teachers have gone down to Antarctica, and I've heard a lot of that culture of, your ice wife, your ice husband, and people that actually just hook up down there and married to other people at home, and and I don't know if that's changing with some of the new Me Too movement or not. People being down there, but.
Hey, is that Devarty?
It's me, Jenna, but
Hi.
I'm going to be on mute.
Oh,
Hey.
That's fine. We just started talking, so feel free to chime in if you want to.
For me, it wasn't even the ice husband, ice wife. I mean, that's just, mature adult choice making. It was like weird mentions of scientific things described sexually, or while talking science, suddenly sexual insertions that just were like these strange comments that were like, yeah, it wasn't the adult decision making that bothered me at all.
We had a thing, so like last year at in Davos, they did a conference, Polar 2018, where they had the big researchers get together, the communities for both both ends, both sides of the poles. And we did a one-day Polar Educator International workshop, and I wasn't there, but I was responsible for putting all the stuff up on our website. And one of the people that was there, she sent me like one of the researchers we had that was presenting had done his slide presentation, and then he put a slide in there about how it was like climate change is reflected in women's underwear. And so he had down like this thing where, it used to be like, you would have like this, 1800s kind of underwear, covered everything. And then it got like 1950s, and now like he was showing a thong for today. And she goes, this isn't right. So I ended up being able to edit it out of his presentation before I posted it up there. And I ran it by my daughter, who's, a PhD student now. And she's like, yeah, that's really weird. She goes, that's not good to put that.
So maybe life on the ice makes people weird.
Maybe, I don't know.
I have seen that graphic before.
Oh my God, I've never seen that, but now I'll never not unsee it. So thank you.
Yeah, it was weird. So, but yeah, so there's still some people like that, and that's still out there.
New gentleman, remind me your first name.
Isam.
Isam. Have you read the book?
Yes, I read it in the summer, so a lot of the details are a little hazy.
Yeah.
I was the same way. I got about 100 pages in again over the last week.
Yeah. So what I liked about it, or the thing that stuck out to me the most, even after all this time has passed on, was kind of the sort of foil that Frank is to Sal in terms of going on through scientific, like regular scientific discovery, whereas at the end of his research, Sal gets proven wrong about his theory of the universe beginnings, but he sort of respects that and sort of respects it through the process of science, whereas Frank is stubborn in his ways, obviously because he's paid to be that. And then it's sort of like, it was interesting seeing that foil, and that's one thing that stuck out to me all throughout this time.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, it's a good umbrella statement about the book and the process of science. And you really, if you do science the way it's supposed to be done and you get the answer you're not looking for, you've still done it correctly and figured something out. No, that's great.
Yeah, probably my takeaway favorite is to build off that I thought the book did an excellent job in all respects of revealing science as a journey, not a fact. Mm-hmm. And actually, I thought it revealed that very nicely for art as well. That art is a journey. The main character went down there with sort of preconceived notions and then was stuck and then got on the glove thing. And, it's like, what is the purpose of my art? And so I thought it really revealed both as activities that are ongoing and definitely a journey.
Mm-hmm.
I was telling Wendy when I first got on that I've been going to this science lecture series on Tuesday nights here on campus, and I kind of skipped the one tonight because I wanted to come here instead. But we had one of the researchers that talked, she does research on black holes, and so what they've been doing is they've got all this data and they're looking at the data and they're trying to prove something. And so in the question and answer period that they have afterwards with some teachers and students, they said, well, what if your theory is wrong? And she goes, well, it's just job security, then I can keep looking for more things, And so that was a really positive way to look at that.
Mm-hmm. There's always more questions.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes getting a hard no reveals a whole bunch of questions. Yeah.
Just a question that I had found when looking at some discussion guides. The book unfolds through various narrative perspectives. So we see some of the stories through Cooper, through Pearl, through Pavano, looking at the emails that she's writing back and forth with her sister and other people, and even through these official government documents. Any thoughts about how having these multiple vantage points shapes your sense of the community? Or in what ways would the story be different if you were only privy to Cooper's perspective?
I like the different perspectives. Like the one that really amazed me was when they were talking about the perspectives of the congressmen that came down there, and how they basically sold themselves out so they could get reelected. And now I can see a little bit more maybe of why our whole government's so screwed up right now, because it seems like a lot of people are doing that, it's like they have to do what their funders are saying, and they have to follow along with that. And I think what was also interesting too was that how that scientist perspective changed, the researcher that was the climate denier, and how he had to go into something he didn't even believe in because he wanted to do science, but then it seemed like it flipped all the way around towards the end there, and he came back to being more honest with himself.
Yeah, I thought the different perspectives added a lot to the book. I think I'd have gotten, bored is not the right word, but complacent with the storytelling if it had been through the one perspective only.
Yeah, I agree. It definitely adds. I mean, you don't hear the perspective of, Pavano's past and how he got there, till the end of the book. But without hearing that, it definitely wouldn't have been a strong climate change book or cli-fi book, without these different perspectives.
Yeah. When I first saw the header of the Pavano part, I'm like, oh no, I gotta read through his perspective, and I contemplated skipping it when I was first reading the book. But as I read on it, it kind of not empathize. It doesn't necessarily make you empathize with the positions, but it makes you kind of understand it and see what goes on through the whole process of why someone with who would like to regularly do science will do a complete 180 to try to basically prove something to fit a narrative, so to speak.
Awesome. Good perspective.
One of the things that we do with our program is with systems thinking is looking at different perspectives, so that's a big part of it, drawing relationships and different systems, and then looking at them from different perspectives of things. Like even, I'm still like amazed that, one of the things that is going to happen in Tucson is that they're going to be taking effluent and releasing it in a local river to get a new part of this river flowing again. And during a brown bag where the director of our water utility was talking about it, one of the, she called herself like one of the historic nanas, or the more of the native people that were there. She goes, well, has anyone ever asked the river what it wants? And, and I thought, that's an interesting perspective. And then as I've talked to more and more people about it, I talked to somebody that I work with in Monterey, California, and what they did was they like re-engineered this whole area to get the river flowing again. And then the first storm, the river just took its own path. And she goes, we should have asked the river what it wanted. And so, I think it's a really good activity to always look at different perspectives and try and understand the different perspectives, especially with our students, and make them realize that there are different ways of thinking and different ways of looking at things.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you bring up a point of, asking the river what it wants, of like using traditional ecological knowledge, TEK, when teaching, and a native perspective. There's a professor that teaches out of University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point, Kathy Techman, that does, she has this GWOW curriculum. I don't know the Ojibwe words. That's what it stands for, is GWOW, and is very place-based curriculum, but just getting that perspective of the native person, or of the land, or of, you know, something besides people or corporations or something like that. So yeah, it's a great question. Great comments. Hey, Ashley.
She's working on joining.
Yeah. Give you a second to get on here.
So I have two super specific things that I made notes about that aren't the big deep thoughts we were just having, but maybe they're good filler while we're waiting for Ashley. One of them is that as a scientist who's done a lot of satellite meteorology and training for others to get ready for the advanced GOES satellite era, there was a specific reference to the GOES satellite like early on in the book. I think it was on like page 58, and that just like warmed my heart. That made me all happy. And then in contrast, as a scientist, there was a stereotyping of scientists as smelling bad, like really specifically, and also a like really, really negative comment about NSF. And I was like, wow, where, you know, that's there. Okay. So the specifics of both pros and cons of those real tie-ins to my real life world made me relate to the book, both good and bad, which is good, right?
You've had some really good connections, Wendy, with this book and last book. Very connected to yourself.
Yeah. When they're talking about NSF and science and funding and meteorology and climate, it's my life.
Awesome. Well, welcome, Ashley. We're so happy you could join us. Just been chatting a little bit about your awesome book. I don't even remember how I came across it, but when I saw that you were local, based here in Minneapolis, I was like, I gotta check this one out. And selfishly, while reading, I was like, ooh, a Minneapolis place. Ooh, we're talking about Minneapolis College here, and different streets and places. So that was super fun for me.
Lots of Easter eggs for Minnesota readers.
Oh yeah, it was wonderful. I really appreciated all of that. So awesome. Well, we would love to have you just talk a little bit about the book in general, you know, your process and how you came up with the idea of the book, and anything else you would want to add.
Sure. First of all, thank you for taking a chance on it. Books, there are so many books published every month that it's hard to even, you know, stand out enough for someone to want to choose you. So I just so appreciate the opportunity. And also acknowledging that anytime you crack open a book, especially of contemporary fiction, it's a big risk. You know, I'm sure that you can relate to that feeling of disappointment, you know, when you're like 10 pages in and you're like, gosh, can I do another 320 pages of this? And I'm sure people have had that response to this book, but I just want to acknowledge that I am so grateful you took a chance on it. I have to give credit to my younger sister, my middle sister, Lacey Shelby. She actually did winter over at South Pole when she was in her early 20s. She actually was a production cook, although she was nothing like Pearl. She's very nice, a nice girl. But she went down there at a time that I was living in New York. It was almost pre-email, at least pre-email for South Pole. So she would write me handwritten letters, and it would have that great South Pole Station postal mark on it. And she would just tell me about this grand adventure she was on. But at the same time, she was frustratingly vague about it. She was giving me kind of broad strokes. So when I asked her about that, I said, dude, you got to give me some specifics here. I need names. I need like actual things that happen, not just broad strokes. She said, you know what? I know Vegas claims this motto, but the truth is it started on the ice, and what happens on the ice stays on the ice. People come down here for reasons they don't necessarily want broadcast to the world. Some of them come here year after year after year because they don't fit in with their family, they don't fit in a workplace, they just don't fit in the culture, or they're running from something. And, you know, after 6 months down here with almost no escape, they start sharing those stories, but they don't necessarily want those stories shared with others outside of that fraternity, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
So, of course, that piqued my interest, and it forced me as a writer to get creative, because my first book was actually a work of journalism. It was about the Red River floods in Grand Forks, North Dakota in 1997, which at that time, it's almost quaint now, but that was the most expensive natural disaster in American history, Grand Forks, North Dakota.
Really?
$5 billion.
Wow.
I know, like, what a bargain, right?
Yeah.
It's actually a little bit chilling when you think about all of the disasters we've had back to back to back that have just dwarfed that. But at the time, that was the largest evacuation of an American city since Atlanta in the Civil War. It was the most expensive natural disaster. Not a single life lost, though, so that was quite an achievement for the mayor. But anyway, Lacey's vagueness really forced me to start kind of asking myself, well, why would people go down there? What are their motivations? What are they there to do? And, you know, just the lightest research into South Pole Station will reveal that you have people coming from all walks of life. So you have the support staff, the construction workers, the people who are serving the meals, the people who are the janitorial staff. Then you have people from, like, you know, Madison, who are just doing this mind-boggling research into astrophysics. You have climate change researchers down there at WACE, which is the world's, you know, foremost, outside of Greenland, we're the world's foremost climate change research site. And so I thought, gosh, you know, how does that work? You know, when it's such a small group of people for such a long period of time in such a hostile environment, how does that dynamic work? How do they make that work? Coming from such different backgrounds. So, you know, it took me a long time. I'm not a quick writer. I feel like many times over the course of writing the book, I just thought, you know, am I really forcing this? I don't know if I have the talent to actually realize my ambition here. Like, why is it so much easier for other writers to finish books? And why has it taken me 6 years to do this? I've since come to realize that's just the way I write. I'm a research geek at heart. I still have journalistic tendencies, and I wanted everything to be accurate, you know, as far as it could be, everything that wasn't fictional. So it took a long time, but, you know, I felt that, you know, for all its flaws, and it is a flawed book. I mean, it's my first novel, and, you know, all first novels are deeply flawed. But I felt like I learned a lot about the human condition just in terms of inhabit these different characters. When they first hit the page, they were just caricatures. They would have been insulting, you know, to any reader to read if I had not gone through these multiple revisions and these years of tearing things down and building them back up. It forced me to inhabit other people's perspectives. So that's why you have a climate change denialist who's not necessarily a villain. I was that person, and to a certain degree I still am, who just dismissed climate change denialists. You're wasting our time. This is immoral. You know, this is laughable. You know, you run the gamut, you know, like from like amusement to rage and back again, mostly sitting in rage at this point. But I had to answer the question that I posed to myself, which was like, why would someone like Willie Soon, why would he do this? He knows he's wrong. He knows this is not correct. Why would he do it? So that for me was the most challenging perspective to inhabit. But at the same time, I felt like compassion is the wrong word because I don't feel compassion for that character. But trying to understand how people come to the decisions that they make. And I think in a way that's why it took so long to write the book, because it took me a long time to get there. So yeah, that's just sort of, I guess, a peek into my process, which is very messy. I don't recommend my process to anyone because it'll take you years upon years to write a book following the Ashley Shelby process. And you'll still be left with mistakes and like plot holes and, you know, but you know, I also teach writing, and I just tell my students, you do the very best you can with your talent and skill and knowledge at that moment. And you just try to do better with each book, or you know, with my students, with each essay or each story. Because if you don't, you'll never write. You know, anybody who's read Nabokov, you know, if anybody was sane, they would never write again. Because, well, hey, it's all been done. Like, this guy's perfect. You know, his sentences are perfect, so why try? So yeah, it's definitely not a perfect book, but for me, it helped me grapple with some stuff that was proving very difficult to understand, the denialism in particular. Probably more than you wanted to know.
No, it's wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. We were just talking about the richness of the different perspectives in the book. So to have you mention that as you were explaining it fits right into what we were chatting about before you joined online.
No, I heard you. I came in just at the very back end. You were talking about the NSF. Will you tell me what your thoughts were on that NSF?
Well, I've never worked at the NSF, but I have many colleagues who work there, and I collaborate with them, and I go there and I visit and I seek funding, and I have funding at times. And I guess there was I don't remember. I didn't bring the book with me because my suitcase was brimming full and I have to lug it all over. So I don't have the actual book with me, but I made a note on page 206. There was a serious NSF bashing kind of comment, and I don't remember what it said now. But then there was also, you know, the whole intrigue of NSF hinted sponsorship of a climate change denier tied to Congress. And I was both really intrigued and could easily see that happening. It probably does happen because people seem to want fair and balanced, and yet that doesn't really fit with peer-reviewed science. And was a fascinating point to bring up in the context of the book. And I guess I worried that in a way it gave fuel to people who wanted to say the science is no better than some other system if it's that easily corrupted, you know. So how did you grapple with what you put into the book to tell that story?
That's such a good point, because that's one thing I think the NSF will never do in real life. For me, that was the big flight of fancy of this book. It was the big what if question. I actually had wondered, I said, God, you know, with all of the pressure that people are under, with all of the state laws being changed, like the boards of education in Kentucky and Kansas, like literally changing curriculum, like that level of power, how is it that they've never been smart enough to try to pressure the NSF to put a climate denialist on the ice, right? Or maybe they have, and the NSF has just been like, yeah, where's your peer-reviewed science? Then we'll talk.
I'm sure they have done the pressuring.
But I thought, what would happen to a research station with people who dedicated their lives to this work, who, you know, and if you know, as you've read the book, you know that there's a big conversation about what science is in this book. And I am firmly in the camp of defender of science. I mean, it's sort of a passion of mine. But you know, what would happen if the NSF was threatened with budget cuts, if they did not represent the taxpayers via science, if that makes sense. And so this was actually a real flight of fancy for me, because I don't think, like I said, I don't think it will ever happen. But what if it did? And so for me, that was that fictional twist that I needed to take that leap in order to create the cascade of events that took place once he was down there. You know, if I stuck to what was probable, you know, which is that, well, you know, they'd make a big fuss and they'd submit this proposal to the NSF, and they'd try to get a lot of media attention, but the NSF at the end of the day would say, no, it just doesn't meet the standard of science. Then I don't have a story to write, because then Pavana doesn't get down there, right? So I have to bet on most of the people reading the book are not going to be like you. You're not going to be looking at it, well, the NSF would never do that. You know, they don't even know what the NSF is a lot of the time. I mean, right. I've done book clubs where, you know, people have said, God, you know, I've never even heard of the NSF before this book. They're also fascinated that artists can go down under the auspices of the NSF, which I think is super cool too. So and then any bashing that's done is often, you know, is sort of like, it's not from me personally. I mean, I'm a
No,
huge,
I didn't think it was.
NSF has funded me a couple times for like conferences and stuff, which I thought was weird because I thought they also might look at something like this and be like, oh, put her on the blacklist. But I actually think of the NSF as a hero in this story. And I actually think they come off pretty darn well, because what they're trying to do in this story is protect the research projects of the other scientists who are down there. Because if the plug is pulled, and we saw this just what, 5-6 years ago, this actually did happen, where when the government shut down and they pulled the plug on some of these big research projects, that if there was even a small gap in the data, the research projects were done, they were kaput. And I remember reading stories about researchers who had put 2.5, 3 years into a project, and because they had a 10-day data gap, it was over.
Wow.
And so that, you know, informed my approach to that aspect of the book, because I thought no one knows what that, I mean, scientists understand the devastation that that causes, but does the person who lives next door, do you know what that means? You know, it's not just, hey, government shutdown, CNN is covering it 24 hours. It's like, people dedicate their lives to do this work to help us better understand our universe. And these political maneuverings by people who probably couldn't even, you know, find square root of 7 are creating so much damage in places they don't even know about.
Well said, actually.
So yeah, I mean, for me, I actually see the NSF as a hero in this story, but of course there are people who hate, you know, in the book, there's characters who are just like, you know, see them as villains, or see them as incompetent, or see them as, you know, making decisions that are, you know, immoral. But, you know, in real life, I really don't think the NSF would ever do that, because I think we would have already seen them. I mean, I think we would have already seen a climate denier down there. And we never, to my knowledge, we've never seen one given access to the research sites. Thank God.
I thought the question it raises is a timely one, because you can imagine with the way things are right now, the pressure and the opportunity for cracks like that to happen seems very close. And so having a conversation and seeing in the book seemed timely.
You're absolutely right about that. In fact, when I wrote the book, you know, for as long as it takes me to write, you know, Obama was president. I thought all this was in the rearview mirror. So I was kind of looking at it from a distance. I was like, oh God, look at how dumb people were, you know, look at how the deniers, you know, they just rose ascendant in the early 2000s. Thank God that's over. But then by the time it was published, because, you know, the publishing process takes so long, suddenly it's relevant and it's climate fiction. That was the other thing that was so odd. It's been included on so many lists of climate fiction when it was not written as such. It's the circumstances that changed. So you're absolutely right. It's unfortunately, it's relevant again. And I think you're right that the cracks are there more than they ever have been.
That's really interesting that you didn't write it as climate fiction, and there it is showing up on all these lists, including ours.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad it's on your list. But I mean, if you look at it as cli-fi, you're probably leafing through it. You're like, what's all these other plot lines? These suck. Sure. Let's get back to the climate, you know? But it's because that was just supposed to be one through line.
We've had a couple of, but last month's book, Weather Woman, was another one by Kai Emmons that it not necessarily was cli-fi, but you could find, you know, those climate change connections.
Okay. Put that one on my list. I haven't read that one yet.
It's good. It just came out November, I think.
Okay.
Another female lead. So
nice.
Good.
Love that.
Other questions or comments?
I like the whole idea of the overwintering. We had a Polar Educator International Conference in Italy a couple of years ago, and we did a live call-in to the Italian base, and they were just getting ready to start their winter, and it was pretty funny because they were all sitting there, you know, in front of the camera and then answering different questions, and you could start to see like these little inside jokes and little, you know, looks that they were giving to each other, you know, or like, uh-oh, it's only starting now. And then The other thing was with that's been in the news lately is in the Russian station where that guy stabbed somebody because he kept giving the ending of his books away, and they both had to be airlifted out. And so they just did a really funny This American Life on it. They had this guy like reenacted. It's episode 666. It was their double episode, but at the very end is a reenactment of that story. It was pretty funny.
Oh my God.
But
Wow.
then I also like the whole thing with the Scott expedition and how they grew up like being part of the Scott expedition. And if you've never been to the Scott Polar Research Institute in Cambridge, they have so many artifacts from that expedition. It's amazing. Like they have the blanket that Titus wrapped himself in, and things like that. And it's just really cool. It's an awesome museum in Cambridge.
Oh man, I would love to go there. That would be
Well, we're doing a Polar Educator Conference there, a little plug in April, and we're starting out at SPRI, at the Scott Polar Research Institute.
writing that down.
Yeah.
Ask
And we're
myself-
actually getting one of our other authors that lives in Cambridge that we read. She's going to do a guest speaking position and help us do our communication session with Megan Hunter.
Hunter. I'm taking notes tonight.
Yeah.
Her book that we read was
The End We Start
End
From.
We Start From.
Yeah.
Awesome.
I wanted to say that somewhere in the book, there was a statement about that deniers are given hope by infusing doubt. And it was absolutely relevant and spot on. And I was thinking about that in other contexts, not just climate science. And, it's probably like one of those fundamental truths of life. Whatever. If you can, we've seen this story, right, with this cigarette smoke and what harm, but it applies to like everything from the most mundane conversation with a colleague to the biggest issues of our time. If you can infuse doubt, then those that have some other perspective or something to gain have hope, or if they just don't want it to be true or whatever. It applies in so many ways.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. In fact, it's been interesting to see this discussion recently. I don't know if you all have been following the David Wells, and I always forget the second part of his hyphenated name, the journalist who's sort of writing about, hey, this is really, really bad. It's going to look like this. It's awful, and it's time to panic. And then the pushback from climate scientists like Michael Mann and futurists like Alex Steffen, who are saying, panic means that we make bad decisions. Panic means that we don't have hope. So stop saying that. But at the same time, what this journalist is saying is actually correct. This is where we're headed. This is the truth. It's hard to look at, but the climate scientists are in the interesting position of wanting to quash that, which I think is fascinating. Not create doubt, like denialists do, but kind of almost soften it so that people won't be so scared that they become hopeless or immobilized. I wonder what you all, being steeped in this, like what you think of that.
Well, this is very similar to one of the quotes from Greta Thunberg, 16-year-old student from Sweden that's been on climate strike since the beginning of her school year. Said something, I think she was at Davos, and said something about we need to act like the house is on fire right now. And Climate Generation does climate change education, some youth engagement and public engagement, but climate change is all we do. And so, we definitely don't want people to lose hope. But I think we've gotten to a point where, unfortunately, we do need to act like the house is on fire. And to hopefully in that we can act rationally and not make mistakes or not, run around with like chickens with our heads cut off, and to make some actual progress. But it's definitely not going to be easy, to get to that point.
Well, as someone who works with young people, because I myself, I go through cycles of having hope, but then also having feelings of despair of like, you know, what my kids are going to have to face, or what burdens are going to be on their shoulders. You know, even things as like, you know, looking at the seasons and saying, are they going to experience the seasons the same way that they did as children when they're adults, or will their children be able to experience the seasons? So of course you go down that road, it can be very difficult. But when I see young people doing what they're doing, going on strike, speaking out, I do feel hopeful. What is your perspective on that? Do you see engagement among young people as something that's isolated among like some activist-minded kids, or do you see a potential for a larger movement amongst these kids?
I'm gonna let the young person give his perspective if he would like.
Yeah. So I feel like, at least in the circle that I'm associated in, there is sort of a heightened sort of like panic situation about what the future will bring, especially since a new IPCC report came out and it said 2030 we could see warming up to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And then when you sort of like calculate that, and then you calculate my perspective, like I'm gonna be about 31, so like I always have a lot of life to live, but we're talking about the stability of our political, economic, even economical structures being sort of weakened, and even more so if you're not privileged, so to speak. So I feel like a lot of kids are taking that into consideration, though when we do take that into consideration, there's sort of a gap between action, in that there are some kids who do act like Greta Thunberg and most of the school strikes that are going on in the UK, but there's also some kids who sort of, or some youth who sort of get shut off and like have this feeling of hopelessness, and then it just goes through cycles. That's how I will put it.
Thanks. Betsy, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, like with Project Drawdown, the other book that we read, we've been teaching that with a lot of the teachers that we work with on building community resilience. And we got to see Catherine Wilkerson, who's one of the editors, come and speak on campus. And, you know, she started it out and she said, you know, if Martin Luther King started his movement by saying, I have a nightmare, nothing would have happened. Instead, he started out, I have a dream. And so, you know, she was talking about how we have this opportunity, you know, this new carbon opportunity to bring carbon out of the atmosphere, to, you know, create all these new things. And you have to frame it that way. And one of the teachers that we work with recently left the K-12 classroom, and she was teaching a climate change gen ed course at the university. And she said that her students were like, oh my God, this is horrible, this is horrible. And then she's like, no, just stay tuned. We're going to get to some better stuff, you know. And then when they got to Drawdown, they were really inspired and they were looking at things and solutions. And, you know, and she had some comments at the end of class, like, I've never believed in climate change. I come from a family that, you know, is just Fox News the whole way. And now, you know, I really believe that it's happening and I believe that we can do things about it. And so I think there's a combination of things. I think you need to give people that hope, and you need to start out with, yeah, this really is bad. The house is on fire, but there's things that we can do, but we need to act, you know, that's part of it. And some of the solutions are simple, starting, easy solutions that we can start with, and others are going to be harder.
Great. So we have a local youth group called YAMIN, Youth Environmental Activists of Minnesota, that we work with, so mainly Twin Cities youth. And most of the time we are hanging on for dear life as they drive the train forward. You know, it's a self-selected group that becomes a part of that. And they are usually, the core group are leaders within their different high schools around the Twin Cities. They're having a student-led event tomorrow at the Capitol. Fingers crossed. We're supposed to get 7 inches of snow tomorrow. Schools are already canceling.
Great.
But a student-led event on, it's called the Youth Climate Justice Summit. And so we are going to the Capitol. They have meetings with their legislators all day, trainings before that, in order to talk to their elected officials about what they need from them. And most of them can't vote yet, but they know that they still represent them. And so it's an incredibly powerful day. And honestly, I'll be so crushed if it doesn't happen. But it's just one of those examples of events that we've been doing, and that our youth staff are just incredible to really let the youth lead on one of those events, to let them feel powerful and that they are in charge. And it's really grown to be an incredible event.
Well, these are our future leaders. These are the future decision makers. And that's the thing that gives me hope. And, and the adults who facilitate this and help them feel that they have agency, are just as heroic, in my opinion. That's the thing I grapple with a lot, is that these kids have a lot on their shoulders. They have a lot coming down the pike, and none of it's their fault. But they're going to have to deal with it, and they're going to have to, I tell my son, all the time, I said, you guys are going to have to come up with some solutions, man. It's not fair. Just like, we have conversations about the fact that the impacts are going to be greatest on those who contributed least to the problem. But, at the same time, to see the energy, to see the hope, give someone like me, I'm kind of caught between the generations, because climate change has never been something I ever questioned. I tend to trust scientists. They know a hell of a lot more than I do. That's just, this is just sort of how I was raised, but it is easy to fall into despair. And so this youth movement, it's funny because it's meaningful on many levels, but even just as an example, to people who are on the sidelines, such as myself, to say, this might be the way that we tackle it. When I see, the Green New Deal being ridiculed, all I think about is, well, you guys just don't know who's coming up, because this is what's going to happen. This is not something to risk. Everything has its flaws. It's better to be overly ambitious than the opposite, but it is the thing that gives me hope. So thank you for doing what you do with these kids, because it helps me sometimes get through the day, because I think, whenever you're completely surrounded by climate news, it can be difficult, especially when you look at the media, and the way that the media tends to handle it is doom and gloom. It's scare tactic. It rarely focuses on, any positive aspect. So this is a real ray of sunshine.
Yeah, I was actually reading a paper not too long ago. It was basically about narrative for the first climate change. So the author was talking about the first climate change refugees, basically being bunch of indigenous communities that have to be displaced due to sea level rise that started early in the United States. And she was talking about how the framing in the news media, in the narrative, made it sort of that other people who looked at from the outside perspective going in were super distant from those communities that were being displaced, and they were almost they were distant, and they also were sort of left hopeless because those communities were seen as others who were seen as others who were powerless. And then what she spoke of later, she was talked about how doing narratives or portraying images of active communities or with agencies on tackling these issues can do a lot in bringing about sort of inspired change and hope to a lot of people who sort of feel distant from everyday climate news.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's exactly how it starts. It's going to happen at the edges of, that you talked about privilege, use that word, the privileged class. I mean, this stuff that happens to fellow human beings, they just are sort of like, well, this is happening way over here. It doesn't affect me. But it will quickly. And I mean, I think that it's going to, I mean, we're going to, I'm working on 2 different fiction projects right now, but one of them is, I think it would fall strictly into climate fiction. And, in that world, the climate refugees are in the United States are domestic. They're Southerners. I live in Minnesota, obviously, and Minnesota is sort of the sweet spot. So welcoming Minnesota, how are they going to feel when they've got, millions of refugees from the Gulf Coast coming to resettle in Minnesota? Are we going to have a repeat of the wall discussion? I have often wondered if the only way that the majority of Americans are going to want to act on climate change is when they themselves are impacted. And I thought that I was onto something until Florida elected Rick Scott to the Senate. Because I thought for sure Floridians will know, because so many of them have been directly impacted, that putting a climate denier to represent them, that's never going to happen. But of course, never underestimate Florida. So I don't know. I mean, it's just one of those things where, I've always assumed that it needs to be direct impact. It's a select few people who have that level of compassion and understanding to say, well, what's happening to the Native Alaskans, that is something that we need to handle immediately. We need to make it right, but it's also going to happen to us in time. That's always been just the select few who are able to go there. But the question is, do we all have to be impacted before we actually take action? Is that when we have these huge changes in Congress, during these elections where we wipe out everybody and it's like the vote climate movement. My dad has the only bumper sticker on his car is vote climate, because he was a journalist for many, many years. So he could never even tell me who he voted for president. He had to be have no opinion. But since he's retired, the bumper sticker he has is vote climate. So whoever's got the strongest climate change platform is who he's going to vote for. So who knows? I mean, this is a brave new world. I just don't even know what the answer is.
Something you just said, Ashley, about, what's it going to mean for Minnesota to have climate change? I wanted to share 2 quick little stories with you, just because I think it's relevant, not necessarily to the book, but certainly to our conversation. One time is that I think it's been 10 years ago already, in a room full of continuing education leaders for professionals, a Navy admiral said, when we were talking about climate change and the need to do training for it, for a professional meteorologist so that they could be better versed in climate science, he said, well, the Navy's pretty excited. It's not every day you get a new ocean.
Oh, no.
Whew.
Man.
Perspective.
That is dark.
And I was at a conference also close to 10 years ago in Europe, the European Satellite Meteorology Conference. And the guest speaker was an extremely famous, world-renowned climate scientist from Norway. I'm sorry, I'm not remembering his name. But, I mean, well published, completely on board in all scientific ways with what will happen in our future climate under the various scenarios. And he was giving his talk, and the whole audience was with him as scientists saying, so tell us the latest and give us ideas on what we should be doing, or how can we convince the public, because this was like 10 years ago. And he said, I dedicated my entire career to this. I know it's happening, and I can also look out and tell, this was an international audience, I can tell you all that it's going to be extremely hard to convince the average Norwegian that climate change is a bad thing. It's going to make everything about their lives better.
Interesting.
Longer growing season for all their food. I mean, that's what,
Yeah.
they're an oil-based economy. And there he was representing the country and the science, and just personally could see all the science and could just say, I don't think we're going to convince many people this is a problem here.
Right.
That's interesting because they did the first International Polar Year Conference in 2010 in Oslo.
Yeah,
And I
this
didn't
was
get
in
that
Oslo.
vibe at all. I didn't get that vibe at all from being in Oslo with this large, climate conference thing. So,
Well, I mean, maybe it's the difference between the climate conference versus the citizenry. I don't know.
yeah, I don't know.
That's absolutely true. I mean, there is going to be a period of time in certain latitudes where, like you said, the growing season is going to be longer. It's going to look short term like things have improved. And it does make me wonder if we're headed towards like a second denial period where that happens. But, on the other side, there's going to be these climate related disasters elsewhere. So I'm hoping that, people are, again, it's that idea of, and again, compassion's not the right word, but just this understanding that even though it's happening to other people in other parts of the world, it can just as easily happen to us, or it will eventually come to us. If people can understand that on some sort of intellectual level, maybe we have a chance of acting, even if things are good in, like, say, the Minnesota area or, Norway, whereas, the scientists said things will temporarily be better. I mean, there's even upsides for Russia for, the melting of the Arctic Sea. They're already planting flags at the bottom of the ocean, for natural gas reserves. And, the permafrost melting for them is not necessarily all bad, but they're measuring things on a different scale than I think people who are, well-versed in climate science are. Because you guys can look down the road in a way that they either can't or are unwilling to do.
And then I'm in Tucson, Arizona, and and we teach about water, and it's like all the water managers are like planning for, they know we're experiencing climate change and that it's only going to get worse, and we're just past, or I think it's kind of hung up again, the drought contingency plan, because they're going to start reducing the amount of water we're getting from the Colorado River. And then just in California, with all the fires, and there's, one of the teachers I work with whose family was affected by the fires there, she said that there was a lot of climate deniers in her family, and now they're like, well, Amy told us this was going to happen, and they're believers now because they've experienced it, and we're experiencing it a lot in the West and the Southwest, and even though our governor won't tell you that, but I think the average citizenry believes in it.
Yeah, it's not a future problem. It's happening now. In this meteorology scientific community, we often say climate change is the weirding of weather. Every pattern we used to understand, every cyclical cycle that was very predictable for this long period is now in question. Things are moving, 2 weeks forward at a time, and species can't keep up. It's not a future problem. It is now. And maybe one of the ways people can relate to it being now is people can relate to their pocketbook. How many natural disasters have you had? How much is your food costing you? Why is your food costing you more? Well, there was drought and there was flood. And both of those things have to do with the weirding of weather, because we've destabilized the thermal structure of the planet. So it's not a future problem. It's a now problem. But I think you have to convince people of that or expose them to that.
I think I want to be cognizant of time. We're at 8:04. But I think a lot of the, some of these examples of like things getting better are very isolated experiences, isolated events that are happening. And yeah, things, will get better for certain populations and for certain countries for an amount of time. But definitely as a whole, the effects, the impacts are overwhelmingly negative. And we always like to use and talk about the National Climate Assessment, for different teachers in different regions of the country, to be able to see what those key messages are for their particular region, and how climate change is affecting them. In Minnesota, there are 6 key messages, some being change of forest composition, changes to the Great Lakes and icing of the Great Lakes and shipping, as well as change in rainfall and warmer temperatures, et cetera, et cetera. But there was another point earlier about, how do you convince people of this? And I think, two pieces of that is, one is to listen, especially to those that don't understand the science, that have not been, privy to that information and have that education around it, is to listen to where they are and try to meet them where they're at. And like you said, Wendy, about, looking at their pocketbook, that, if they're being affected economically with these issues, that is usually a place where you can meet them and say, well, let's talk about that. Let's understand why that's happening that way. And then another piece that we have had really great, seen really great effects with people is storytelling. So having people find where their lives intersect with climate change, because 10 years or 12 years ago, when Will Steger founded our organization, he was an eyewitness to climate change. He saw it in the Arctic. He saw it in the Antarctic. Well, now we are all eyewitnesses to climate change. And to find how you are affected and to be able to tell your story is a pretty powerful experience. And a lot of people don't know what their story is. They don't know some of those causes of climate change. Florida, sea level rise. I think a lot of people just don't understand that that's a correlation of climate change. And once they, realize that and realize that they are, in fact, affected, it can become very powerful for them to understand that. But I want to go over a couple of things to kind of finish up and to welcome us into our next book for next month. But if there's anything else anybody else wants to say or add, please feel free at this point.
Yes, one point that I sort of want to go back on, and that's how can Florida, when facing sort of the direct impacts of climate change, elect Rick Scott, who famously is a strong climate change denier. And to tie it back to the book, one quote that always stuck out to me when I read it in the summer and I kept thinking about this book is that when Frank Pavano is sort of doing his conference with the other scientists in the room, and when he says, I'm just trying to contest that this warming is not man-made, and then Pearl says that I would prefer that the earth was not warming, and then Pavano retorts that it may not be, and then Pearl says, that makes me feel so much better. That I think that's one of the powerful tools that these climate change deniers have in communicating with the general public, and that they are able to sort of give these ordinary people a false sense of ease and hope that the earth is not warming, and that we don't really have to panic, and we don't have to do these massive actions that will sort of disrupt our way of life. So it will be an interesting dynamic to see how, when other communicators who talk about climate change, how they can get ordinary people to break out of their mentality and say to them bluntly that yes, this is happening, and I know this is scary, and you might have to do a lot of things that you're not used to, but we're all in this together and we all have to do something. And I'm just figuring out how people can communicate that so that they can put the regular people, or give them hope, so to speak.
You bring up an excellent point. When you're talking about that specific scene in the book, and how climate change deniers are doing that in real life, you're really cherry picking data. You're cherry picking tiny little bits of information, and unfortunately, it's such a disservice to the public, to our students, that they're able to do this and communicate in that way. Merchants of Doubt, the book and the movie, the same concepts that worked with the cigarette industry are still at work with climate change, and it's so unfortunate. Any other thoughts? It's not an answer to your question or whatnot, but just kind of a freestanding thought. Any others around that? Well, I will say, as we kind of finish up here, I think cli-fi and climate change books in general really do a service that, you know, you're able to portray a situation that is based in fact, but has, you know, other bits of story wrapped up in it, and elicits conversation that you would not, I think, otherwise have without it. Obviously, our goal here with the TeachClimate Network meetings is to, you know, pull out that cli-fi information about from different books. But something that we're going to focus on in May, we're reading Grapes of Wrath and pulling out some cli-fi or some climate change ideas from a book that you wouldn't necessarily think about could be on a cli-fi list. And I think cli-fi, especially for students, that middle school students for sure, that are already in this angsty time of their life, to, you know, have dystopian type fiction and stories that may be kind of that anti-hope really resonate with them and really are able to kind of teach the topic, shake them up a little bit, in order to talk about the concepts of climate change in just a different way, to not only young people, but I think to anyone. So, with that, I have talked for several months about new humanities curriculum. It is absolutely going to come out in our May e-newsletter. So just context, we have 2 new humanities modules that are coming out, one based on The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind. So when I say module, it is some worksheets that go along with the book, focus on climate change content of the book, science lessons, social studies lessons, service learning, all put into kind of one 80 or so page curriculum. That will come out the beginning of March. And then the second, A Long Walk to Water, same ideas, will come out the beginning of April. We've really wanted to make sure that they're just top notch and done well. We've had a graphic designer be looking at them, so she's just finishing up edits on the first one. So finally, I was like, talking to my boss today, I was like, I really need to see these out there before I go on maternity leave. Like, they need to get into teachers' hands now. Our next meeting is going to be, at this point, Wednesday, March 20th, and the book is empty. It's a shorter read, definitely middle school, maybe early high school, cli-fi. So if you are able to join us next week or next month, this is going to be the book. So it's just real quick, it's the future, the very near future, and the fossil fuels are running out. No gas, no oil, which means no driving, no heat, supermarkets are empty, malls have shut down, life has just become more local than we ever knew it could be. So definitely dystopian cli-fi fiction, but a great quick read. If anyone is interested in being a volunteer blog writer for that book, I will send you a free copy of the book, and you can blog for us. I will be writing the blog for South Pole Station. Super excited. This has been a really wonderful conversation. Ashley, can't thank you enough for joining us and kind of giving your background of the book and how you got to write that. So we really
Thank you, Ashley. It was really a pleasure having you join us tonight.
Well, thank you. It was a privilege, and I have lots of notes that I took.
Yay.
I got a lot out of it. It was wonderful to meet all of you. Thank you so much for what you do.
Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. I will email out the recording and a few notes and stuff if anybody wants to get in touch and have further conversation with this. But thank you so much. This has been excellent, and hopefully we'll see you all next month.
Take care.
Right.
Good night.
Thank you.